The U.S. Constitution requires that every 10 years, the total number of people residing in the United States, including citizens and non-citizens, are counted. The simple act of counting people for the 2020 census, however, is becoming anything but. What are the issues and what would an undercount mean for California? We'll ask Alex Padilla, California's Secretary of State, John Myers with the LA Times, and Sarah Bohn with the Public Policy Institute of California. Countdown to the 2020 census.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The 2020 census will have major implications for California. Our guest is Sarah Bohn, who is the Director of Research at the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, and she's here to help explain everything about the 2020 census. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So could you give our audience kind of a primer on the 2020 census, the who, what, when, where, you don't need to say why, we know why we're counting, and how of the census?
Sure. So every 10 years, as mandated by the Constitution, the U.S. government undertakes a systematic count of everyone residing in the U.S., regardless of their citizenship. And the Census Bureau asks
that's just an important point. It's population, not citizenship.
That's right.
Okay.
It's all residents.
Okay.
And the census asks us to respond with just a few key pieces of information about age, race, ethnicity, home ownership, and household members, and maybe this time around about citizenship. Yeah. This happens April. The census day is April 1st, 2020.
April 1st, okay, that's...
Yeah, April Fool's Day.
Could be problematic, yeah.
But you could expect to start seeing mailings from the Census Bureau as early as March 2020.
Okay, and this is for, there are a lot of implications of the census. One of them is political. So what are the political implications for the 2020 census?
Well, this is really the key purpose of the census, as written into the Constitution. The census count allocates seats in the U.S. House of Representatives across states.
There's a fixed number of seats, and they allocate it based on population. So in other words, if some other states are growing faster than California, let's say Texas, they're going to get more congressional seats, we'll lose seats.
Yeah.
That's the way it works.
And that's what we expect to see.
Okay.
We expect, based on population trends, if the census is accurate, that California will maintain probably its 53 seats. We could stand to possibly lose a seat, and faster growing states like Texas, Oregon, Arizona, I think, Colorado are on the list, who are likely to gain a seat in Congress.
And one of the problems is there's also folks that are hard to count, whether they're renters or homeless or whatever. And the more you have of those, the more likely you're undercount, and that could have an impact on things like representation.
Exactly.
But there's another thing it has implications for, and that is the distribution of federal dollars. Some of the dollars, not all of the federal dollars, obviously, but some of the dollars are tied to population. How much does that mean in real dollars for California?
So in recent years, we've received over $100 billion in federal funds to California that are tied in some way to our population count. So the census really has become an indispensable part of the federal government allocating those resources in the way that's intended by policy. So sometimes it's on a per capita basis, sometimes it's trying to target certain populations like, say, young children in poverty. And census statistics and other Census Bureau statistics feed into that and really help kind of allocate funds in a way that we think is fair and is in line with intentions of policymakers.
But not every federal program is based on this. For example, Medicaid, my understanding is there's like a set minimum that California is going to qualify for regardless. Correct?
That's right, which is good because that's a big budget number for the state. So we're kind of at the minimum level, and undercount will not affect our Medicaid dollars, federal dollars that come to California, but other programs like transportation dollars, children's health insurance program are a couple examples where a differential or an inaccurate census could affect the dollars going into communities across the state.
Right, okay. So in addition to congressional representation and allocating federal dollars, what else is the census used for?
Well, it gives us really a detailed portrait of our population, and it's a rare once every 10 years opportunity to do that. So in a sense, the census will follow us for 10 years. It's the most detailed picture of residents of our state. We also build Well, the Census Bureau builds surveys, annual surveys, on kind of the frame of the decennial census count. So when you see monthly unemployment numbers or other annual statistics about our population, our labor market, our economy, a lot of that is kind of built on the foundation of the census. And that's why it's so critical to get it right in 2020.
But there's also local governments use this as well, right? And K-12 and businesses. I mean, this is more than just how many people and that the government needs for reallocation of representation or money. It's, a lot of people use this number.
Yeah, businesses, hospitals,
Researchers.
schools, researchers use it to understand the impacts of policy, but also to target kind of services, to target business locations and things like that. It's really indispensable for just understanding California.
Who we are. Okay, up next, some of the fastest growing groups in California also are the hardest to count. So what is California doing to deal with that hard to count population? That conversation next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about the 2020 census with Sarah Bohn, the Director of Research and Senior Fellow at the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. It's been stated that there are some large segments of California's population that are historically hard to count. Who are these individuals and why are they so hard to count?
So renters, young men, in particular, children, African American residents and Latinos in California have historically been undercounted in decennial censuses. This is despite the Census Bureau's best efforts to count everybody as accurately as possible. In California, about three-quarters of our population belong to one or more of these demographic groups, which makes it quite a challenge.
Are hard to count.
That's right.
Wow. And so you have a situation, renters, where you have roommates who maybe want to say that it's only supposed to be a single and they got two people living there, those kind of situations.
Yeah.
Okay. You want to say anything about it?
Well, the census is a household survey, so it's easiest to count households where it's a homeowner who's been there for a while, which tend to be white, older residents of California. They're the easiest to count. And so younger populations or populations that move more often
more transient,
are just
moving around in different locations. That's typically
it's harder to count.
So what are some of the political and economic factors that could exacerbate the problems and why? So things like the housing crisis, for example. How does that impact the census or the citizenship question, for example?
The housing crisis is one I'm particularly concerned about because, as we talked about, this is a household survey, and the housing crisis has pushed more families or individuals into non-standard arrangements. So maybe splitting a house or splitting a unit in a way that's not even reflected in an address roll, and so those households won't be surveyed in the same way.
So that's particularly a problem, like in the high rent districts, right? The coast. I'm thinking there's also going to be a situation in the inland part, if you have a lot of undocumented, that's also going to be an issue. And that gets to kind of that citizenship question of whether they're concerned that somehow that's going to come back and hurt them in some way.
Yeah.
So what about the citizen? Because there's been a lot of talk about the citizenship question. What are your thoughts on that?
That's right. I think the current political climate, mostly federally, reasonably makes immigrants more reluctant to respond to government surveys. And the citizenship question has just kind of highlighted that distrust of government and uncertainty. And so, I think a lot of residents of California, when they receive a form from the government or a Census Bureau worker knocking on their door, might be unsure of whether they can safely respond, even though in federal law, the census is only to be used for counting the population and no other purpose.
Well, let me ask you this. Your organization, the PPIC, reports that these hurdles have intensified about undercounting and noted that the GAO, the Governmental Accounting Office, has designated the 2020 census as a quote-unquote high risk for failure. How so?
A couple of the factors that have played into that risk of failure have been vacancies in leadership at the Census Bureau, some of which now have been filled, but I understand that a few still remain, and just the resources and capacity to test new systems. So this census will be the first that we're trying to mostly collect online responses. It's a whole new way, actually, of conducting the census. And
kind of makes an assumption that everybody has a computer, everybody has access to the internet.
Yeah, the Census Bureau will target areas that have more access to the internet, and those who don't will receive a paper form. But nonetheless, it's a big shift in how they collect information, which in the long run could be a cost-saving measure, but poses some challenges this time around.
You also were mentioning that testing it. So they're trying a new procedure, but they haven't really tested whether it's going to work?
They've had to, because of budget shortfalls, kind of pull back on some of the planned tests.
Right.
They're doing a lot of testing to make sure this works, but the citizenship question, which was added very late in the game, there isn't much time to test that question to see how it changes response rates.
It seems to be like there's an emphasis on efficiency somewhat over effectiveness. In other words, doing the census as, frankly, as cheaply as possible, and that may cause you a problem in terms of getting a correct count.
It's definitely a risk. I think the Bureau switching to technologies that we all use every day is definitely a reasonable way to go about it. And the Census Bureau staff are, extremely serious about their jobs and do actually an amazing job at counting the millions of people that we have in the state and the country. But there are some risks, extra risks this time around.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Up next, we're going to talk to a person who's key in helping ensure that California does get an accurate count. That's California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Our guest is California Secretary of State Alex Padilla, state official who has a key role here in making sure we have an accurate count of the census here in California. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
So what specific actions is your office taking to ensure that the 2020 census will be a complete count, get the right number of people in the state, and also an accurate count, that we capture the characteristics of the people correctly?
Right. It's not just my office. I'm asking every public official to leverage their office to put the word out of why it's important for every Californian to participate in the 2020 census, because there's so much at stake. It's a once every 10-year survey required by the U.S. Constitution, right, to conduct a national population count. The results of the census, it's data that if people know anything about the census, they know that it's what drives federal funding formulas for the next 10 years. So what's at stake? For starters, billions upon billions of federal funds for healthcare, for education, for infrastructure, transportation, housing, et cetera. But in addition to that, census data drives the reapportionment process, right? How many representatives California versus other states get in the U.S. House of Representatives. So literally our voice in Congress is at stake, which is why we're going to work so hard to make sure we get an accurate account as possible.
You've written that, quote, the Trump administration is working deliberately to undermine the accuracy of the count. California can't afford to sit idly by while the administration sabotages the census. Why do you feel that way?
Look, it's no secret. Trump has California in the crosshairs. Whatever he can do to damage California, he'll do that, whether it's jeopardizing federal funds or anything else. But in this particular case, how about locking in a federal funding formula for the next decade that hurts California? So what are the tactics that the administration has used to try to risk an accurate count? Most recently, we've heard of this addition of a citizenship question, right?
Now, why is that a problem? I mean, under the Constitution, we're supposed to count population, not citizens, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so why is citizenship, why is that question, why is that troublesome to you?
Because it's not just that we're skeptical. We've seen the effect of a question about citizenship in the past. It discourages or intimidates diverse communities from participating in the census. That's the reason that it hasn't appeared on the decennial census for more than 70 years under both Republican and Democratic administrations.
And the Census Bureau themselves have kind of said that the citizenship question could be problematic. And
they're scientists, they're advisors, everybody gets it, they've advised against it. This administration doesn't care. They've put it on in addition to, for several years, the Census Bureau was underfunded and understaffed. So a lot of the preparation going into the decennial census year, they're trying to play catch up now. I'm not sure they're going to get there. And another bit that most people aren't talking about is this will be the first digital first census.
Explain that.
So, most of us who've been around a while remember getting a form in the mailbox.
I don't know why you looked at me when you said that.
I said us.
You did.
To how many people live in the household and then all the information about them that's requested in the census. Mm-hmm. This time it's going to be different. You will get a letter with instructions of how to go online and submit that information.
Well, I see a lot of problems with that.
I see a lot of problems with that too. There is still a digital divide in America. There's still a digital divide in California, both from an access standpoint and a literacy standpoint. So we have to overcome that in pursuit of an accurate count.
Those very populations that are hard to count are the very people most likely not to have computers or access to computers or computer literacy.
Exactly, and all the data is there. So knowing that we can't count on the federal government as a key partner in this year's census, California is stepping up. Governor Brown on his way out and Governor Newsom in his first year are investing state dollars to do the budget for early planning and outreach plans going into 2020.
Yeah. The census, that citizenship question, is that information going to be shared with, if they get that question on the census, would that be shared with other government agencies like ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement?
It's not supposed to, right? But every 10 years, that outreach to hard-to-count communities is important because there's already a lack of trust to be overcome in getting people to participate in the census.
Right.
Clearly, we're in a unique time right now, not just in the national political environment, but the specific tone and tenor coming out of the Oval Office right now. So all that much more work to do to try to rebuild confidence with people, to make sure they participate in the census and that their information will not be used for other purposes.
The other thing too, I just want to ask really quickly about the digital divide and using this technology. It seems like they're focusing on being efficient in counting, but not necessarily effective, because they haven't really tested whether this stuff works, have they?
No. Again, in the years leading up to the decennial census, the Bureau has been understaffed, and they haven't made the plans nor tested the questions in the various formats. That's typical of what you would do in a survey like this.
Right, I'm sure it works. Yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I want to ask one last question, if I can fit one in here, about 45 seconds. The LAO, Legislative Analyst's Office, recently reported that with better funding, better technology, and better statistical analysis, it's unlikely that California is going to have an undercount along the lines of the one we had in 1990. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, in an ideal world, maybe, but we're not getting that sufficient funding out of the federal government. California is trying to fill a hole along with counties and cities up and down the state. And the ideal technology assumes everybody has access to it. But that's not the case. So we know what we're up against. We're prepared to step up to the challenge.
Yeah, billions of dollars at stake. Thank you very much for being with us, Secretary Padilla. Up next, the politics of the 2020 census with LA Times Sacramento Bureau Chief John Myers. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So how will the 2020 census shape California's politics in the coming decade? Our guest is John Myers, LA Times Sacramento Bureau Chief. He's the right person to ask.
I hope so.
Welcome back
Thanks.
to the Maddy Report. So a major political controversy surrounding the 2020 census is whether a question about citizenship should be included. Some have noted that the citizenship question has been asked in the past. Of course, the last time it was asked for everyone was 1950. But why is it so controversial now?
Well, in 1950, we were a very different California, fewer people and diversity, not the same as it is today. It's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it's important symbolically, and I think some of the critics of asking the question see the symbolism of a change in the conversation nationally about immigration, about diversity. But it does have real-world implications. Funding formulas are tied to the census, so the size of your population, but how much money you get from the federal government. Clearly, representation in Congress, House of Representatives, and whether or not California keeps all of its seats or loses one of its seats as other states grow a little bit bigger. The implications are big. I think we have only heard the beginning of this fight. I think we're going to hear a lot more.
Yeah, there are a lot of people that are undocumented, like within families, and so people, I guess, are concerned that somehow that they're going to be outed, the undocumented, if they, I guess, get involved with the census, if they're involved in answering questions.
Or just simply that someone doesn't want to talk to someone when they come to the door. And Mark, we should also point out that this census is going to be conducted online, digitally, more than any census before. So if someone gets the email or the connection for that census and says, I'm scared because I don't want the intrusion, then that's another opportunity lost. There are big implications all the way around.
Let me ask you this, just how concerned are state leaders that the 2020 census is going to result in an undercount?
I think they're very concerned. You have seen funding for an effort at the state government level to ensure that there's a fair count. I think
there's like $100 million that they've put aside for.
Yes, and created a quasi-state agency or a group, inside state government to deal with it. I think you're going to hear more about outreach, about education to people about what the census really means, especially if the citizenship question move forward. And I would not be surprised to see monitors, checkers, people trying to hold the system accountable in the state of California. I think the stakes are high. I think Democrats who lead the state, Governor Newsom and beyond, are going to keep an eye on it.
And I'm wondering about this. What impact, if any, do you think the Trump administration's insistence on the citizenship question is going to have on the California Republican Party generally and the 2020 election in particular? Is there going to be any blowback?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I have not heard a single thing from the California Republican Party about it. The Republican Party in the state already trying to figure out how it navigates the tricky waters of Donald Trump isms. And I think that this is an interesting moment, right? Because the conventional wisdom could be you could line up behind the president and say citizenship matters, or you could chart a different path and say citizenship matters, but this isn't the right way to go about it. It could be an opportunity for the Republican Party in California, but so far we haven't heard a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. 40% of the California population is Latino. It would seem to be that this is going to have an impact one way or another on the outcome. Let me ask you this. I'm just trying to get my head around whether this makes sense politically. So you add the citizenship question, it's going to result in an undercount, but it's not just going to affect California. You've also got red states like Texas, you've got purple states like Florida, of course you've got a large blue state like California, but isn't it going to impact all of these states if you have that citizenship question?
I certainly think it could, and I think you would need some kind of a researcher to give you the proper answer, but I go back to the fact that no one that you're hearing that has concerns about this question is advocating that we for counting people who are in the U.S. illegally more, or that there's something. They're simply talking about the fear, the perception, the lack of access to communities, the fact that the message can get muddled somewhere and no one wants to participate. That would seem to be a problem anywhere in the United States. But in California, with the dynamic that we've had, with the fear and the anger about it, I think it is probably larger than it might be in those states. But you're right, it does raise a question about the whole country.
I want to ask you something. William Frey, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has written that, quote, in the past, filling out the census was thought of as a national civic engagement exercise, which allows people to claim that they are residents of America. Politicization would not only lead to a flawed census count, but would further inflame divisions that have come to fore in the past 2 years. What does that say about the census? That one thinks that we can't have an objective, nonpartisan process of counting residents. It now has become politicized.
I think it says, quite honestly, what a lot of people who are watching the show know, that everything has become politicized, it seems like, in this environment that we're sitting in right now. The census was a place we didn't think about it. Some of the services, the way we build roads and bridges and where we do these things, they were not political animals in a different generation.
You think about that, all these topics that have become politicized, and the census, I think, is kind of a great example.
Yeah,
of
right,
that.
Because we all were taught that this is just like a head count.
Yeah.
And now it's no longer a head count, it's more complicated.
It seems like nothing could be more objective. And so it's probably the greatest example of how hyper-partisan things have become.
And I think that no matter who wins this ultimate fight about that question, we're going to see a politicization and anger, and it's not going to go away. And that's the hard part of this.
Oh boy. Well, with that, I want to thank our guest, John Myers of the LA Times. Things will get better.
Yes.
Also, California Secretary of State Padilla and Sarah Bohn with the Public Policy Institute of California. If you want to stay up on current politics and policy, you can log on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.